The hotel stands silent now, its walls repainted, its rooms filled with laughter once more. But beneath the polished floors and soft lights lies a memory soaked in smoke and blood. Once, these halls echoed with gunfire and whispered vows of defiance, while death crept up every staircase. Step inside the Hotel Mirabelle, and you open a door to a night when liberty lived here, and survival meant facing terror on every floor. The winter of 1943 wrapped the North Atlantic in an iron grip, the sea heaving like a restless beast beneath skies heavy with snow. Convoy HX 379, a lifeline of 42 merchant ships, departed Halifax under the protection of 6 Royal Navy destroyers and a single Canadian corvette. Laden with wheat, aviation fuel, and critical machinery for Britain's war effort, the convoy carried the fragile hope of a nation still reeling under German U-boat attacks. Among the sailors, a grim superstition had grown. The stretch of ocean called the Black Pit, where Allied air patrols could not reach, was a graveyard waiting to claim them. The convoy's journey began uneventfully, though the men shivered in the freezing wind that sliced through every layer of wool and oilskin. Captain Harold Simmons of the SS Briarfield recorded in his journal that the sea seemed to hiss with malice, and that gulls followed the ships like mourners. Their escort commander, Commander William Hargreaves, kept a sharp eye on the gray horizon, knowing that somewhere beyond sight lurked the wolf packs of Admiral Donitz. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic in tight formation, waiting to strike at night like a pack of sharks. On the 4th night, an unexpected coded transmission reached the convoy, a directive to alter course sharply northeast toward a rendezvous point. The signal bore all the hallmarks of genuine Admiralty orders, and Hargreaves obeyed without hesitation. What the convoy did not know was that German intelligence had learned to mimic Allied communications, and their diversion steered them straight toward Wolfpack Greif, a flotilla of 5 U-boats led by Captain Lieutenant Otto Kramer. That night, the hunters closed in. The attack began under the cover of darkness. A lookout aboard the tanker SS Clearwater swore he saw the sea spitting fire before the torpedo struck, igniting the fuel in a column of flame that lit the night like a macabre beacon. Panic erupted across the convoy. Signal lamps blinked frantically, sirens wailed, and merchant captains struggled to maintain formation as the escorts weaved to launch depth charges. In the chaos, 2 more ships, SS Lonsdale and SS Fairhaven, vanished beneath the waves, taking dozens of men with them into the freezing black. Survivors later recalled the horrifying sound of steel snapping under pressure, the sea roaring into hulls, and the haunting cries of men trapped in the water as burning oil spread across the waves. Despite the heroics of the escorts, the convoy's cohesion collapsed. U-boats struck again before dawn, sinking another 5 ships. Commander Hargreaves tried to rally the survivors, ordering them to scatter in small groups to confuse the attackers. For some, it was too late. By morning, smoke and debris stretched across miles of ocean. Lifeboats drifted between the corpses of men and the skeletal remains of cargo. A handful of ships still limped toward Liverpool, including the battered SS Briarfield, which carried an unusual crate, fragments of a German Enigma machine taken from a captured weather trawler months earlier. Ironically, the very convoy targeted by the U-boats delivered the key that would one day help Allied codebreakers predict their movements. For the men in the lifeboats, survival became a desperate fight against exposure. Captain Simmons described in his waterlogged journal that frost formed on their eyebrows, that their skin burned like fire, then turned to stone. The sea was alive with shadows, sometimes the flicker of distant fires, sometimes the sleek silhouette of a U-boat surfacing briefly like a ghost. On the 3rd day, a Royal Canadian Navy corvette returned to the debris field, pulling half-frozen men from the water. Only 123 survivors from the convoy's merchant crews were rescued. Over 500 perished in the freezing Atlantic. The story of HX 379 was buried in wartime censorship. Official reports cited heavy weather and unforeseen enemy activity, but whispers among sailors gave it another name, the Ghost Convoy. Years later, when declassified OSS files revealed that German agents had compromised Allied communications in Halifax, historians began to piece together the betrayal. Convoy HX 379 had not simply been unlucky, it had been steered to its doom by a phantom signal born of intelligence warfare. In 1958, an aging sailor named Thomas Leland, one of the few survivors, returned to Halifax to speak to a naval historian. He recalled watching his friends slip beneath the ice-crusted waves and hearing their voices fade into the wind. "The sea remembers," he said, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "Every wave out there has a name if you listen long enough. HX 379 is still out there. She's still sailing, in the dark." Decades later, deep-sea explorers located the wreck of the SS Clearwater, split cleanly in two, its decks still scattered with twisted barrels and the skeletal remains of sailors who never escaped. On a calm day, the North Atlantic seemed almost to guard its secret, as if the ghost convoy still moved silently beneath the swells. Naval tradition holds that every May, when the fog is thick and the air carries the bite of winter, ships crossing that region lower their flags in memory of the men who never came home. The ghost convoy of the North Atlantic remains a somber reminder of the invisible war beneath the waves, a war fought not just with torpedoes and depth charges, but with deception, silence, and the endless, unforgiving sea. In the spring of 1944, the dense jungles of Luzon whispered with the sounds of war. Japanese occupation forces had dug in for years, building fortified positions and controlling the major towns, yet the mountains and valleys still belonged to guerrillas who refused to surrender. Among them were the men and women of the 2nd Luzon Irregular Regiment, fighting a shadow war with weapons scavenged from fallen soldiers and supplies parachuted in by the Americans. Into this world of rain, mud, and whispered passwords stepped Captain Eleanor Hayes of the Office of Strategic Services, a woman whose wartime mission would later become a tale spoken only in the guarded tones of old soldiers. Hayes had not come from a military background. Before the war, she was a stage magician in Chicago, famous for vanishing acts and sleight of hand. The OSS had recruited her in 1942, impressed by her skill with misdirection and coded communication. By the time she parachuted into Luzon under the cloak of night, she was already known among operatives by her codename, Lantern. Her mission was audacious and perilous: locate and sabotage a convoy transporting experimental Japanese aerial mines. If deployed, these mines could devastate American invasion fleets gathering for the liberation of the Philippines. The guerrilla camp that welcomed her was a patchwork of bamboo huts hidden under thick canopy. Commanding the group was Captain Ramon Villanueva, a former schoolteacher turned fighter, whose men were as comfortable ambushing patrols as they were melting into the jungle. Supplies were scarce, and every bullet mattered. Hayes brought not only intelligence but also tricks, false signals, smoke devices, and improvised illusions to confuse the enemy. Her plan for the operation would hinge on deception and timing. Intelligence from a local defector, Private Kenji Sato, a disillusioned soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, revealed that the convoy of trucks carrying the aerial mines would move through a narrow valley 2 nights later. The plan was simple in concept and deadly in execution: draw the convoy into an ambush zone by making them believe they were under air attack, forcing them to halt where the guerrillas could strike. Hayes designed the ruse using hand-painted kites and paper lanterns soaked in kerosene, which, when lit and released into the night sky, would mimic the silhouette of incoming aircraft in the moonlight. The night of the ambush arrived with heavy humidity and the buzz of unseen insects. Guerrillas crouched in the undergrowth, their hearts pounding as the rumble of engines approached. Hayes and 2 young fighters launched the kites from a ridge, the flickering lanterns rising into the sky like a swarm of ghostly bombers. Below, the Japanese drivers panicked, braking and swerving as officers shouted orders. Some leapt from the trucks, believing an air raid was imminent. That moment of confusion was the signal. Explosions ripped through the night as the guerrillas detonated charges along the roadside, flipping the first 2 trucks and trapping the convoy in the valley. Gunfire erupted from the tree line, muzzle flashes strobing through the dark. Private Sato, now armed and fighting alongside his former enemies, led a small team to the lead truck, where the mines were stored. Under fire, they attached grenades to the crates and withdrew. The explosion that followed lit the valley in a searing orange glow, sending shards of metal and flaming debris into the sky. The firefight was brutal but swift. Within 20 minutes, the convoy was annihilated, and the few Japanese survivors fled into the jungle. The guerrillas vanished just as quickly, carrying their wounded through muddy ravines to a hidden camp miles away. Hayes documented the success in a coded message sent via a hand-cranked radio. Paper lantern burns bright. Convoy destroyed. Zero mines operational. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese scoured the valleys for the mysterious air attack, convinced that American planes had somehow penetrated their defenses. They never realized they had been fooled by fire and wind, by the illusion of an enemy they could not see. For Hayes and the guerrillas, the operation became a point of pride. "We made the mountains lie," Captain Villanueva would later say in an interview, his voice aged but still fierce. They believed the sky itself had turned against them. Operation Paper Lantern had a lasting strategic impact. With the aerial mine project crippled, American forces were able to advance on Luzon with far fewer naval losses than feared. When Manila was finally liberated in 1945, several OSS officers quietly toasted the success of a mission most of the world would never know. After the war, Eleanor Hayes returned to Chicago, performing magic again for small crowds in smoky theaters. When asked about her wartime service, she would only smile and say, "I once made the enemy chase shadows." It was not until 1972, when the last surviving guerrilla shared his story in a local veterans gathering, that the operation received even a whisper of public acknowledgement. He held up a faded paper lantern, its edges scorched, and said, "This lit the night that we became the storm." The story of Operation Paper Lantern is now remembered as a rare fusion of ingenuity, courage, and the quiet power of deception in war. It reminds the world that in the darkest nights of occupation, light can come from the smallest, most fragile flame. August 1944 arrived in Paris with the smell of smoke and fear. The Allies had landed in Normandy 2 months prior, and the German grip on the city was weakening. Still, the streets of the French capital were a chessboard of danger. Wehrmacht patrols, Gestapo agents, and desperate snipers occupying the rooftops. In the heart of this volatile city stood the Hotel Mirabelle, a modest 5-story Art Deco building on Rue du Château d'Eau, not far from Place de la République. Its balconies were draped with faded awnings, and the grand chandelier in the lobby still sparkled, though dust had long settled on the marble floor. The Mirabelle would soon become the unlikely stage for one of the smallest yet fiercest sieges of the liberation of Paris. Madame Clarice Dufour, the hotel's owner, was a widow in her 50s with a reputation for iron will and sharp wit. She had watched the city surrender in 1940, had endured years of rationing and humiliation, and had quietly aided the resistance by passing messages in laundry bags and hosting secret meetings in her shuttered dining hall. By August 19, 1944, Paris was on the brink of uprising. Shots rang out in the streets as the French forces of the interior and various resistance cells began open rebellion against the German occupiers. That night, 19 members of the resistance, including 2 British SOE agents, slipped into the Mirabelle. They carried rifles, Sten guns, and a single Bren gun smuggled in pieces under bags of potatoes. Madame Dufour locked the doors behind them and declared, "Then this hotel shall serve liberty tonight." The German response was swift. A platoon of SS soldiers, retreating toward the city center, discovered that the Mirabelle's roof now sported a makeshift barricade and a free French flag stitched from tablecloths. At dawn, they demanded surrender. The resistance fighters refused. The siege of Hotel Mirabelle had begun. The first attack came with rifle fire and machine gun bursts, shattering windows and sending clouds of plaster from the ornate walls. Inside, the fighters returned fire from behind overturned tables and the reception desk. The Bren gun roared from the 3rd floor, cutting down a German advance along the street. Smoke filled the lobby as German grenades shattered the glass doors, but the fighters had retreated upstairs, firing down stairwells and tossing improvised Molotov cocktails. Civilians who had taken shelter in the cellar huddled in fear, listening to the deafening exchange above. By the second day, the hotel was scarred and bleeding. Bullet holes riddled the facade, and the chandelier lay in ruins. Food was scarce, and water came from the building's old rooftop cistern. Yet morale remained high. In a rare lull between firefights, Madame Dufour brewed coffee over a small gas stove and handed cups to the young fighters, insisting that Paris must have coffee, even in war. That night, They sang a hushed rendition of La Marseillaise, their voices trembling but proud. On the third day, the SS tried to burn the fighters out, rolling a fuel barrel against the entrance and setting it alight. Thick smoke billowed up the stairwell. Resistance fighters smashed windows to vent the choking fumes, and one of the SOE agents, Sergeant Daniel Price, braved gunfire to kick the barrel back into the street, where it exploded harmlessly. The crowd of onlookers that had begun to gather in nearby alleys erupted in cheers. Word spread quickly through the district. The Mirabelle was holding out. Reinforcements for the resistance arrived in the form of street fighters and gendarmes who had mutinied. They could not enter the hotel without drawing fire, but they harassed the Germans from the flanks, forcing the SS to divide their attention. By the fourth day, the situation had shifted. Free French tanks and American jeeps were entering the city from the west. Hearing distant gunfire and the rumble of armor, the SS platoon abandoned the siege, retreating toward the Seine to join the collapsing German defenses. When the fighters finally emerged from the battered hotel, they were met with an eruption of cheers from local residents. Photographs capture the moment. 19 ragged fighters, smoke-streaked and grinning, with Madame Dufour standing proudly among them in her soot-stained dress. Above them fluttered their makeshift banner, a patchwork of tablecloths that read, in hastily painted letters, La Liberté Loge ici, Liberty lives here. The aftermath of the siege revealed the true cost. 3 fighters had fallen, and the hotel was a shattered shell. Bullet-riddled walls and burned staircases told the story of defiance. Yet Madame Dufour refused to close the Mirabelle permanently. After the liberation, she hung a framed photograph of the fighters in the lobby and kept one room untouched, its walls still marked by bullets and scorch marks, as a silent memorial to the days when the hotel became a fortress of freedom. For decades, Parisians who walked down Rue du Château d'Eau could see the small brass plaque outside the restored Hotel Mirabelle. Here, in August 1944, the free spirit of France held firm. Tourists sometimes passed by without noticing, but for those who knew, it was a sacred place, a reminder that courage often hides in the most ordinary of buildings, waiting for the moment history calls its name. The winter of 1942 carved the Soviet Union into a frozen wasteland. German forces had launched Operation Barbarossa the previous summer, and by the time the snow fell, they threatened the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial arteries that kept the Red Army alive. Tanks without fuel were just metal coffins, and Stalin's generals knew that without a solution, the defense of Stalingrad and the counteroffensive that would follow could fail. In secret, far from the eyes of both German intelligence and even many within the Soviet military, a plan emerged that sounded like a fantasy born of desperation. Build a temporary pipeline across the frozen Kara Sea to deliver fuel from Arctic tankers to Murmansk, using the ice as both highway and camouflage. It was code-named Operation Snegovik, or Snowman. The pipeline began as a trickle of rumor among engineers drafted from Leningrad and Arkhangelsk. They were told only that failure was not an option. Supplies arrived in unmarked rail cars, steel pipe, welding gear, rubber seals, and crude oil stored in drums marked with nothing but a red star. Hundreds of Gulag prisoners, shivering in threadbare coats, were conscripted as labor. They were promised a reduction in their sentences if they survived the winter. Many wouldn't. The Kara Sea in January was a hostile world of ice hummocks and screaming winds. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes faster than any bullet. Men labored on hands and knees, bolting pipe lengths together, their breath turning to crystals that coated their scarves. Welding in such temperatures was an art of misery. Torches sputtered in the wind, and any bare metal could tear the skin off a hand in an instant. To conceal their work from German reconnaissance planes, they covered exposed sections of the pipeline with snow and carved trenches in the ice, letting nature hide the lifeline that would feed the Soviet war machine. The pipeline's purpose was simple: pump whale oil and crude fuel offloaded from icebreaker tankers anchored beyond German patrols, then push it toward Murmansk, where it could be refined and distributed to the front. Soviet engineers improvised constantly. When pump motors froze, they built fires under them. When pipe cracked under thermal stress, they patched it with rubber, cloth, and prayer. Every mile gained was a small miracle. By February, the first fuel flowed. It traveled slowly, thickened by the cold, But it moved. Red Army tank brigades near Stalingrad, short of fuel for weeks, suddenly found their supply improving. Soviet historians would later estimate that over 20,000 barrels of crude and whale oil traveled through that icy artery during the critical months before spring. Every T-34 that rolled into battle carried, in part, the lifeblood of Operation Snegovik. Life along the pipeline was a nightmare. Men lived in snow caves and makeshift huts of driftwood and ice blocks. Wolves prowled the edges of the camps, drawn by the smell of frozen rations. One engineer, Anatoly Bereznoy, later recalled in his secret memoirs that the wind sometimes howled like the ghosts of those already frozen beneath the snow. He remembered one morning finding 3 prisoners frozen in place, sitting upright against the pipe they had been guarding, snow covering their faces like burial shrouds. They were buried on the spot, under a crude wooden marker that simply read, "Snowmen." German intelligence never discovered the pipeline. Aerial reconnaissance mistook the faint lines in the ice for natural cracks, and radio intercepts never picked up the operation's codename. By April, the Arctic sun returned, and the ice began to break. Crews frantically drained the pipeline, salvaging what materials they could, knowing that the sea would soon claim the rest. When the thaw came, much of the structure was swallowed whole, leaving almost no trace for post-war investigators to find. The last shipment of fuel reached Murmansk just weeks before the pipeline dissolved into the sea. Operation Snegovik remained classified for decades, known only to the survivors who called themselves the Snowmen of Stalin. After the war, some were celebrated as heroes. Many of the Gulag prisoners were quietly returned to captivity, their service erased from official records. It was only in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that fragments of the story emerged from military archives and whispered family histories. Photographs showed frostbitten men beside endless stretches of pipe vanishing into the horizon, their faces hollow but defiant. The Arctic blood pipeline, as Western historians came to call it, was both a marvel of desperation and a monument to sacrifice. Without it, the Red Army might have faltered in the winter of 1942–43, and the great turning of the tide at Stalingrad could have been delayed or even lost. Today, no visible remnant of the pipeline remains, but under the shifting Arctic ice, somewhere, lie the rusting bones of a lifeline that once pulsed with fuel and human will. And in the long polar night, when the wind sweeps across the Kara Sea, some locals still say you can hear the faint clang of ghostly hammers and the low hum of a pump that refuses to die. May 1945 brought the end of the Third Reich, but the Atlantic Ocean still hid secrets in its cold depths. As Berlin fell and the guns of Europe went silent, a lone German U-boat, U-977, slipped away from the collapsing front. Its commander, Captain Lieutenant Heinz Schaefer, knew the war was lost, but he refused to surrender in Europe. His plan was audacious: to carry his crew across the Atlantic to Argentina, following the rumors that Nazi fugitives would find refuge in South America. This journey would become infamous not only for its daring but for a single chilling broadcast that still echoes in naval lore. The voyage began from Kristiansand, Norway, under the cover of night. On board were 32 men, crammed into the steel coffin of a Type 7 U-boat, carrying limited fuel, rations, and a single gramophone to ward off the oppressive silence of the deep. They submerged for days at a time, surfacing only under darkness to run the diesels and replenish air. Outside, the Atlantic was vast and indifferent, its swells rising like mountains, and the men slept beside torpedoes, knowing a single leak could become their grave. According to Allied records, U-977 evaded capture as Germany surrendered on May 8. While most U-boats turned themselves in, Schaefer pressed onward into the South Atlantic, convinced that somewhere on a foreign shore a future awaited. But as the days stretched into weeks, isolation gnawed at the crew. Morale frayed in the damp, claustrophobic corridors. Several men became convinced they were being hunted by unseen escorts. Others swore they heard voices in the static of the radio, fragments of home that could not be real. Then came the broadcast. On the night of June 23, 1945, Allied listening stations in the Azores intercepted a faint Morse signal. Its source was identified as somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. The message was brief, sent only once. Der Krieg ist fort, aber wir sind immer unter Juk. The war is gone, but we are always among you. The transmission sent ripples through Allied naval intelligence. Was it a coded signal for a hidden wolf pack? A psychological operation meant to unnerve the victors? Or the last defiant whisper of men unwilling to accept defeat? Frantic orders went out to patrol aircraft and destroyers, but the ocean gave up no sign of the phantom sender. The signal faded into the static, and the source was never confirmed. For the crew of U-977, the broadcast became a taboo subject. In post-war interrogations, Schaefer denied ever transmitting it. Some sailors claimed they were submerged and silent that night. Others muttered that a junior radioman, half mad from weeks without sunlight, tapped it out on his own as a final act of rebellion. The truth was buried under layers of exhaustion, paranoia, and the cold code of survival. After 66 days at sea, U-977 finally surfaced near Mar del Plata, Argentina, in August 1945. The war was over, the Reich dissolved, and the men were promptly interned. Their arrival sparked global headlines and fueled countless rumors of Nazi escape networks. In the interrogations that followed, Allied officers asked repeatedly about the last broadcast. Schaefer's answer never changed: "We sent no such message." Official reports were inconclusive, leaving the mystery to drift like the fog over the ocean. In the decades that followed, the legend of U-977 grew. Conspiracy theorists claimed the message meant that Nazi agents had infiltrated South America, or that secret U-boats prowled the seas long after the surrender. Maritime folklorists told darker tales, that the signal was a ghost transmission, a fragment of defiance trapped in the ether, echoing across the Atlantic long after the crew reached land. Divers eventually located the wreck of U-977 after it was scuttled by the Argentine Navy in the 1950s. No radio logs confirming the transmission were ever found. The steel hull rests in silence on the ocean floor, encrusted with coral and sea life, the final resting place of a vessel that once carried men into exile and infamy. Sailors crossing the South Atlantic still speak of the last broadcast in hushed tones. Some claim that on calm nights, when the radio is tuned to an empty frequency, they have heard a faint, rhythmic tapping in the static, a whisper of a war that refused to die, and a reminder that the sea keeps its secrets better than any man. When the siege ended, the city cheered, but the walls of the Mirabelle had swallowed every scream and every secret. Some say that on quiet Paris nights, if you listen close, the old hotel still breathes with the shadows of 1944. It is a place where courage and fear once danced in the flicker of gunfire, and where history waits, patient, behind a single closed door.